Alright team, in this tutorial, is tutorial number 5, we're going to talk a little bit about what we call instance variables and scope in computer science, and then we're going to get into segues, which is transition between view controllers, so we'll get back a little bit more into our project. So to start, let's go ahead and talk about scope. So what I had here before, we had these variables x and y, and we learned that they could be passed in as parameters. Well, what's to stop you from saying, let x equal 4 here, and then calling print x in here? Well, what's going to happen is your Xcode's going to complain, and it's going to say that it essentially couldn't figure out what this variable x was, what it was coming from. And the reason being is that x was actually declared in this function viewDidLoad here, which is inside these squiggly braces. And anything that's declared, declared meaning that it was created, so this let x, cannot be used outside of these squiggly braces, okay? Which is why we need to pass it in as a parameter. So that's essentially what scope is. And yeah, so one interesting thing you can do on what we call our instance variables are you can actually set or declare the instance variable in the class. So instead of doing let x equal 4 here, we can say let x equal 4 up here, and now we can see that if we call x in here, it's going to recognize what x is because we've declared it in the class, and it was outside of these squiggly braces, or outside of any functions. It's just inside the class. So the scope of x is in the whole class now, right? Before it was just in the scope of viewDidLoad, but now it's in the scope of everything between these squiggly braces, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So now if we run this, this is going to say print x equals 4. So that's what an instance variable is, and that is what essentially the basis of scope. Great. So now that you understand variables and scope, let's go ahead and delete some of this practice code that we're using, and let's start getting into some of the real stuff here. Okay, so we can delete this print number function. This shouldn't be complaining. It'll update in a sec. There you go. Great. So what I did is actually at the bottom you'll see this commented out code. It should have these little stars around it. What I want you to do is just go ahead and delete the star slashes, and that should uncomment this function right here. This function is prepare for segue, and essentially what that means is this is going to be called whenever a segue is going to occur. And a segue is what we call these little arrows here. These are called segues. So anytime one of these segues is being executed, this function is going to be called. Anytime one of the segues coming out of this main view controller, so see how these segues are coming out of this view controller, these are going to be called in main's prepare for segue. Okay, so let's just do a little test here, and let's say print segue, oops, sorry, gotta put it in quotes, segue happened. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. Run it. Let's see what happens here. Alrighty, so if I click, so nothing in the console here, right, because nothing's happened yet. Now if I click cat, we can see that segue happened, right? So this code got executed when it was segueing from the main view controller to this view controller. Now if we click back, this isn't gonna, it's not gonna print again because we were actually segueing from animal view controller back to main view controller. Okay, so but now if we click, let's say we click dog, segue happened again because we were segueing from one view controller, or from the main view controller into another view controller. Great. So that's what you need to know about, I guess, essentially what a segue is. Now you can see, before we talked about parameters, right? So you can see in this prepare for segue, we're getting passed in two parameters here, which are kind of those variables that we were talking about um, in the last tutorial video. So we have sender and we have segue. We don't really need to worry about what sender is, but we really need to worry about what segue is. So segue, remember how we said x was of type int? Segue is of type UI storyboard segue. So that pretty much just means that it's of type segue. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say let let's say let storyboard. Actually, you know what? Yeah, let storyboard segue equal segue. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say print. So what I did here was I set a variable to this value up here, and this value is this UI storyboard segue. And what we can do is we can go ahead and print this. Whoops. We can print storyboard segue. We could have also just done let segue, but I wanted to show that you can actually store segue into a new variable here. Okay, so let's print storyboard segue. They're the same thing right now, but what I'm also going to do, just for the sake of learning, is I'm going to set a breakpoint here at print segue. What this means is your code's going to execute, and then it's going to pause right at this line of code. So on print, we're going to pause. So let's see what happens here. All right. So nothing's happened here. Now when we click cat, our app is, see how it kind of paused. Oops. And we're going to get this breakpoint. So this this green over here, and see how it's kind of highlighted a bit. This means that we're paused on this line. Okay. So now in the bottom console, right next to our console, we can see all. This is like our debug area. We can see all of the variables that we're working with here. So sender here is in our scope. Right. We talked about scope at the beginning. Segues in our scope. Self, we'll talk a little bit later about what self means, but self is everything that's in the class, so any class variables. So we would have had x in here if I left x, but I took that out. We'll talk about self more later, and then we have storyboard segue, which you can see here. So let's click into storyboard segue, and you can see that it has all of these variables here. That are associated with it. So storyboard segue is its own class, and inside the class it's going to have its own variables, right? So in the console, PO just means print out. Actually, no, let's not get into that. What we're going to do here is now you can see that we have a storyboard segue, okay, and we can store that in this variable. Really what we're trying to do is just identify what type of segue this is, whether it's coming from the dog or whether it's coming from the cat. So when it pushes a new view controller on, then we can customize that appropriately, right? Okay, so let's take a step back. Now we know that we can store these functions. Sorry, I just dragged that out to get rid of it. Let's move into back to the segues here. Let's figure out a way that we can identify it now that we know we can store these segues in a variable here. So let's go to our view controller, or sorry, our storyboard. And let's click on our segues here. Oops. Okay, so I ran into an issue. See how this says segue to show animal detail view controller, and this is show segue to view controller? That's an issue because this is actually an animal detail view controller here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this segue here. I'm going to delete it, so I'm just going to press the delete button, and then I'm just going to make that connection, which was control drag. Okay, so if you control drag, you'll see it'll give you the options. We're going to use show. Now we have a new segue. So yeah, that was an issue. We wanted to go to animal detail view controller, not just the normal view controller. I don't know what got messed up there, but great. Now we're all set. So if we go to let's go to the segue that's associated with the dog, right? So what you're going to see here when you click on that segue, when you have that segue highlighted, and you'll see it's associated with the dog, you're going to want to set the identifier of this segue. So let's set this identifier to be dog underscore or dog dash segue. Oops, well, that's not how you spell it. Segue. Great. And then let's set this to be cat dash segue. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to differentiate between the segues. So when we run this again, let's go keep our breakpoint here. When we run this again, what we're going to see is here we go. We're going to see it stop here, and then inside our storyboard segue. Interesting. What happened here? Oh, okay. Sorry. Let's actually look into segue, not storyboard segue. Oh, and that is all right. Sorry, we're having an issue here. Okay. Anyway, so we set this identifier. Where else we can actually find this identifier? It's going to be attached to this segue inside one of its variables. So to get all the variables out of segue, you're gonna append a dot to it, right? And so it's going to give you a bunch of suggestions, but we want the identifier. So let's change this storyboard segue variable to say storyboard segue identifier, and let's update this to print out the storyboard segue identifier. Now, what's going to happen is whenever we click segue, it's going to print the segues identifier, right? So if we click dog, it's going to click dog segue. If we click cat, it's going to click cat segue. What's this complaining about? Okay, it's about casting. Let's not worry about that. Let's just ignore that for right now. Alrighty. So let's run this. And let's click cat segue, and look, we're going to get cat segue. And it gave us this awkward optional. I'm not going to get into optionals right now, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's go back in here, click on this little triangle, and it's going to give you options to give you options to fix it. So let's actually click this force and wrap here. So there we go. And yeah, so now next time we do it, this will just say cat segue without the optional around it. This exclamation mark pretty much just means that we got rid of this optional. Optional means that it can either have a value or no value. So if we tried to print and this segue identifier didn't have any value, then it would it would be what we call null or empty, right? So anyways, that's really what you need to know about optionals right now. It's not very important. I'll make sure that I cover everything with optionals when we get through them. But yeah, awesome. So now we know how to identify our segues. We know how to store objects into variables and how we can get variables out of objects. Great. And until next time.